All good. So in 2022, during the Omicron wave of the COVID pandemic, I had the true honor of working as a spiritual health practitioner at Victoria General Hospital. We used to be called being a chaplain. And it's an essential part of the training for ministry. Most ministers talk about it as a highly formative and even transformative time in their journey towards ministry. So it was no different for me. My time there was such an incredible experience of companioning people through the vulnerability of their diagnoses, the deaths of their loved ones, their own deaths, heightened by the isolation that many people were experiencing during the pandemic. So after I had been in the role for a few months, I felt like I was starting to understand it a bit. I got a referral to go visit with a 92-year-old patient who had just been declared palliative and who was struggling with some anxiety. So I put on my lanyard and I went over to the general medicine floor to go visit with her. And when I got there, this patient, who was a very petite woman who looked amazingly well considering her condition, she was essentially having like a panic attack. Like so many in our overburdened medical system, she wanted more care than the staff were able to provide her with. She was worried they weren't taking her vitals often enough, and she also expressed desperation to leave the hospital. She begged me, just do whatever it takes to get me home faster, even though I knew she was already on track to be discharged that day and she was just waiting for her daughter to arrive. So my first reaction was to initially feel this sense of urgency to do something. Like I thought, should I somehow get her released faster? Could I? Should I go try and get her vitals taken again? Should I do something? Then my own still small voice within reminded me that so much of what I had learned at my time there was that I probably don't need to do anything. I just need to be here. So I sat by her bedside, I took her hand, and I said, I don't know about that, but I'm here with you right now. So the effect was really almost instantaneous. She just relaxed. It was like a spell had been broken and a new spell had been cast. So just by showing up with her, I could cast a little spell of tranquility. I wound up spending a few hours with this woman, much longer than the normal 20-minute visit we were taught to do, until her daughter arrived to bring her home. So during this visit, we talked a little bit about her experience of hospitals, the differences in care that she had encountered, good experiences and bad experiences. We talked a lot about peacefulness. And we talked about her life. But we also spent a lot of time just sitting in silence with me holding her hand. I never had another patient thank me so profusely at the end of a visit. So this is what I learned about our shared humanity while working in the hospital. Sometimes the best thing we can do is just be with what is. In a culture that constantly pressures us to do, if we're gonna think about just being at all, then the first thing we often think about is being productive. We're taught to measure our days by what we accomplish. The social norm is to say how busy we are. So letting ourselves just be takes some serious spiritual discipline. But it's only when we learn this spiritual discipline that we get access to the world that Peter Meyer talks about in that song. So the world where the red-winged blackbird is as holy and magical as God burning in a bush. So I found that in the hospital setting, this need for the spiritual discipline of just being was particularly true as a Unitarian Universalist. As a Unitarian Universalist, unlike the Catholic priest, who I occasionally called for sacrament of the sick, and as an agnostic, I couldn't sincerely tell anyone that I thought they were going to go to paradise after they died. I couldn't tell them that I thought prayer would heal them. I couldn't tell them that what was happening to them was happening for a larger reason, that it was all part of some kind of divine plan. But being in the hospital, I had to hold even that kind of agnosticism from a place of humility. You just can't connect with a patient if you walk in the room thinking that you know better than they do. So when I did encounter patients who had these fixed beliefs about God or heaven or prayer, people who had a deep sense of connection to God, I also honored those beliefs. When I was sitting holding the hand of a devout Catholic in his 40s who was dying of pancreatic cancer, I wasn't thinking about how I disagreed with his theology. I was just right there in the valley of the shadow with him, saying the Lord's Prayer in earnest. I was so grateful that even in my United Church upbringing, I learned that prayer to God, our Father who art in heaven. Because whatever it means to me is so irrelevant in that moment. Our differences in beliefs just get swept aside by the intense fragility of our shared existence. So we were taught in my training to do a spiritual assessment. This is kind of an informal assessment of the patient's spiritual well-being, and it flows naturally as part of an organic conversation. So one of the things that we were taught to look for was whether or not this person has a sense of the sacred. And over the course of my time at the hospital, working with the sacred became increasingly important to me as I saw its power. And we weren't given a definition of the sacred, but I reflected on it a lot in my time there, especially in connection with my environmental activism and the phrase which is often used by Indigenous land defenders, defend the sacred. So sacred, as I reflected on it more, to me, and I think everyone has their own personal understanding, but to me it means what has ultimate value because it has no price. So things like pristine water and air, our relationships with our family and our friends, our relationships with our community, which you've already spoken about so much today, you can't put a price on those things, but they have ultimate value. So in spiritual assessments, you could tell pretty quickly if people had a sense of connection to that or not. And for many people, surprisingly, even in a place like Victoria, the idea of feeling connected to nature or to anything larger than themselves is very foreign. Many people are so isolated that they don't have relationships that form the core of their lives. And that's part of what we risk losing in this secularizing culture, not just the outdated dogma, but also that communal, spiritual component of human existence that is part of what makes life worth living and illnesses worth surviving. It's why our commitment as Unitarians to a faith community without dogma, based on covenant, not creed, is so, so precious in these times of both personal and social polycrisis. So many of my patients were in the stroke ward, and they had suffered catastrophic losses of function. And I had quite a few patients who had lost the will to live. And the more socially isolated they were, the more likely this was to be the case. Peter, would you mind holding up that book, the purple book there? So when I first started working there, I wanted so badly to help people connect to reverence for the natural world that I carried around this book with me instead of a Bible. So it's a book called The Wonders of Nature. And other people would have their Bible, and I would have this book carrying around with me in my little notebook. So sounds like some of you recall last time I was here, I talked about reverential naturalism, coming from work by Paul Bramadat at the Center for Studies in Religion and Society. And Paul defines reverential naturalism as an embodied perspective, according to which a deference to, and for many, a veneration of nature is a distinctive, maybe even definitive feature of what it means to live well here on these unceded Lekwungen territories. So reverential naturalism is a form of spiritual practice. It's a way of connecting to spiritual qualities of awe and wonder and, of course, reverence that enable us to grow spiritually. So to my mind, it was a form of spirituality that could be accessible even to the most secular people, even to people who have a deep and most times very understandable distaste for organized religion. But what I learned was that I couldn't really do the work of reconnecting to the sacred for people. It was very hard to spark that connection if it wasn't already there, no matter how cool that book is. So I could just be with whatever spiritual tools were already present for people, and maybe help call some greater attention to those tools by my own compassionate inquiry. So when we leave the path of traditional religion, as we have all done as Unitarian Universalists, we can either live as though nothing is holy, or we can live as though everything is holy. Go outside in the forest and everything is sacred. Walk by the water, do it with a reverent air. Take a moment to recognize the worthiness and dignity of those closest to you, our first principle. The fact that their very existence is a miracle. So when we realize that this world is not just a second-rate hand-me-down of heaven, we can connect to the felt sense that everything is sacred, something that we experience as much with our hearts as with our minds. So that re-enchantment of the world, that's what Silvia Federici calls it, it's essential to trying to undo the mentality that treats nature as a set of commodities to be exploited. It's also a powerful tool in times of grief and loss. So the research on spiritual care demonstrates that this sense of enchantment helps people thrive more in times of adversity. So we have to continue to cultivate that sense of the sacred, the holy, the reverential, even when we leave behind conventional religion. We're smart enough not just to reject tired, old, unscientific dogmas, but also to recognize that there is still wonder in being alive. We are still part of a great mystery. So we come together in Unitarian Universalist community to be reminded of our proper role as human beings with respect to the natural world and cosmic forces. We come together to worship, a word that is not always comfortable in our Unitarian Universalist communities, but just comes from the old English word worthscape, meaning worthiness. So to be reminded of what has ultimate worth because it has no price. To slow down, to let ourselves be present to all that might arise in our heart and in our mind when we let go of the need to do and just be. We are here not just for intellectual stimulation, but also for spiritual sustenance. So at the end of my visit with this 92-year-old woman, aside from her thanks, the message that she really wanted to leave me with was, life is short. Life is so short, she said. So even her 92 years had felt short to her. So in the short time that we have here, let's give ourselves the gift of experiencing the holy, the sacred, the enchanted world that we come here to be reminded of and to praise. I know that some days we don't feel very connected to that awe and wonder, and some days we are spending our one wild and precious life doing the laundry, or our taxes. But the beauty of life is that as long as we draw breath, we can always try again tomorrow, to make time to reconnect to wonder and reverence and a sense of the sacred. Thank you for being here to create that opportunity for reconnection together, to express and explore our Unitarian Universalist commitment to supporting each other in our spiritual journeys, in our free and responsible searches for truth and meaning. These are essential parts of our covenant, the sacred promise that we make to each other as members of this faith.